So, all of this process of making videos and seeing oneself in reflection and sharing outward through the internet to try and share one's ideas with the world likely is not to get some feedback from the world about what do people think about the art that has been captured by the camera in the pixels on the screen, with the hue of the colours in between the extremes of the dark and light. Dark being labelled as negative, light being labelled as positive. Dark feminine labelled as evil, male positive labelled as good. God being good, God being masculine, God being high, devil being low, the depths of despair, the heights of ecstasy. So we're all on a spectrum kind of thing. And all the words we use are labels. And feelings have no words. And the mind came into existence like a computer kept in the temples to compute, to add diction. So there's add diction and there's prediction. And diction itself is addictive. It's there in the words. And prediction is before words. So prediction is the feeling half of the self, is able to predict before something happens, before something is put into words. As the feeling self is able to feel something before it happens, a premonition. The mind is after the fact. The mind is the moment after the moment, the time after now. The past is present. The feelings are carrying the past in the memory. The memory is in the feelings. And the mind accesses what's in the feelings and processes and creates a mental model from the past sent into the present, which is a model of the moment now. The present is a model made by the mind from the graphic user interface, from the epigraphs, from the images in the imagination of the mind, reconstructing what he thinks happened in the past and creating a his story of what he thinks happened in the past. And writing, when we began to write down symbols and be able to read and write the symbols, then we're recreating a collective past that's passed on through the books and the parchments. And for those who can read, it becomes as if those words are law, as if believing everything that's been written is loyalty to the royalty of the religions who are the patrons of the scribes, providing the paper, providing the libraries, providing the circumstances. Over the space of this so-called 5,000 years of history since writing began, and the 3,000 years of history, 3,500 years maybe, of history since writing began in earnest in the compilation of what we now call books. In that 3,000 years, we have progressed to creating machine computers. The tapestry involved in weaving carpets was a large step along that way. Crafting of carpets, the weaving of patterns into a substance that you could stand on with your understanding When you're standing on a carpet and you're looking at what's on the tapestry, you are there's an understanding beneath your feet that you can stand on and rely on, that this is our heritage. We have inherited this from the previous generations. And in many ways, that was a feminine art. When it becomes the loom and the machine starts making these things, the word machine is a feminine word. It's got machine. And it's replicating what the seamstresses could do mechanically. And that moves on to Babbage and Lady Lovelace. Lady Lovelace was the feminine partner of Lord Byron. Interesting stuff. But they then made a kind of a counting machine. I can't remember what that was called, maybe, but yeah, I don't quite remember. But it was the earliest prototype of what became between a loom to a digital computer. So when you start using electricity, the light is encoding into the memory. So the magnetic strip is imprinted with the lights in order to record in the magnetic field the information that the light is encoding. And the code is like binary code kind of stuff. According to the mythology of all of this stuff, or the history of all of this stuff, Turing in his childhood had a best friend, possibly had gay aspirations towards that friend as a teenager, but the guy died young. And so Turing felt like he wanted to communicate with this guy through death. So what Turing was at was to try and communicate with the soul realm from the physical realm, and to be able to receive messages from that soul realm encoded into the physical realm. So however it is that this teenager developed this longing to be able to communicate with a dead friend, and that longing inspired him to the researches that he did, which wasn't just computers. There was a lot to do with biology and genealogy and whatever what he was studying. But inherently it's a desire in mankind to be able to communicate with the unseen worlds. It's Ouija boards, in essence. It's channeling information, in essence. It's the mind being able to interpret between the embodied feelings and the disembodied feelings, between this incarnation, the present incarnation, and the previous incarnations, and potentially future incarnations. So the idea that parents could communicate with the soul realm to invite a soul to become conceived and born in the womb and born to become a future generation. So this idea that this generation has, speaking to the previous generations and the future generations through feeling, become a mental aspiration. And because that's held in mind, and because the information is being downloaded through the feelings, through the truth, through the writings, through a sequence of logical progressions, through discoveries. Discoveries, why is that the word? Because it actually says disc ovaries. Ovaries, the feminine. A disc, a plane of magnetic information. So all the analogies really are there between what's going on in the human biology becoming the silicone biology. Or let's call it diology, the silicone stuff, because di means two, and it's all that binary. So we have a binary. So initially what I'm talking about here is there is a feminine half of the brain and there is a masculine half of the brain. The feminine half of the brain feels the whole field and can feel what's about to happen in the next moment in time. Yeah, the sequence that leads up to the feeling that's tracking what's been stable. The feeling that can feel that something is about to happen that may cause a disturbance. The fear one can feel when one is going into a dangerous field, and the mind doesn't really know what's in the field. But from experiences, the mind becomes a program which can predict what is likely to happen based on what has happened before, because the mind has been recording all the information that it can from the magnetic field, processing it to predict the probabilities. But mind can only deal with probabilities of what has happened and add, because this is the sequence that has happened so far in a logical progression, this is likely what will happen next. And that's what the masculine mind in a male or female person is doing all the time. So when I'm saying masculine, I'm really talking about outer, the outer world of sight in light. When I'm talking about the other half of the brain being feminine, I'm really talking about the absence of light before there was light, in the darkness, being able to feel the whole field without being distracted by a torch that's showing just a little bit and you're just seeing the little bit. So all you're focusing your mind on is the little bit of the whole that you can see. Yeah. Because the visible spectrum is a small spectrum compared to the whole spectrum. Because there's the ultraviolet and the infrared and everything, all the way down into darkness, all the way up to an intensity that we can barely conceive of, beyond the intensity of a white sun in a visible spectrum. So the feminine is able to predict what's coming into the feeling field like a birth. Whereas the outer world is only able to gather the information of what it's been focused on and gathering information about as data from the past, from what has already happened, and make guesses about the probability of what could happen. And that's where we get choice. And a choice is a dilemma. And a lemma is where a decision is to be made. And a dilemma is that there are two distinct possibilities of what to do, which one to choose. And so that's the idea of free will. With free will, because we have a mind that can make choices of, this is what's happened so far, and based on what's happened so far, maybe I'll try something different. And that's a sequence, and there's a consequence. Con generally means with. Con is a word that actually means with. So with sequence, if I do this, then this will be the next step. If I do that, then the next step will be different. If I do what we've always done, we'll likely get the same result we've always gotten. But if the result that we've always gotten could do with some improving, because there's always this thing that's not really working very well, then maybe we need to learn to adapt to make things better. So the masculine outer mind is constantly trying to fix what's gone wrong in the past and experiment to see what could we do slightly differently or greatly differently to fix for the future. So this is the idea we have, that the future is progress and the past is regress. That we can't go back to the past, but we're moving forward. And these are the languages of politicians moving forward. The languages of business executives moving forward. Everything is towards an ideal future. And if you're like, hey, the past was actually better than what's going on in the present, you've totally fucked things up with your attempting to fix things, then that's the idea of wanting to go back to the past. And that's to conserve the past, which is to be conservative. And that's where these days we have the idea that the right wing are conservatives and the left wing are progressives. The left wings are trying to make a more idealistic future by moving away from the past. So the left have the idea that the past was fucked up and that we can fix the past, have to leave a lot of stuff behind and uproot ourselves and continue progressing to this idealistic future kind of thing. And so the left and right are totally at odds with each other, like the future is at odds with the past and the past is at odds with the future. That's what's really going on here. And it's representative of these two halves of the mind. You could say that the feminine is holding on to the past because it actually holds the memory and is conserving the memory. And you could say that the masculine is the outer intention to change what has been the past, to use the past to create a different future. So the left are somehow supporting all this technology shite, and at the moment it's the right on the surface of things who are against technology. So it's my right-wing friends who are like, well, what's the fuck going on with all of this data center stuff all over the world, and particularly in Ireland? It's using up all the resources. Why are the so-called left-wing green environmentalist people, why aren't they up in arms about all the energy that the data centers are using and all the water that it's using? And in a way, like symbolically in the way I'm talking here, the data centers are using up loads of water because they're actually extracting information from the water in a subtle level, as well as the cooling effect of water, as well as the water comes from the deep kind of stuff. But all that processing creates a lot of heat we associated with the sun and the heavens kind of thing. Elon Musk is throwing all of his military spaceships into the sky, and the military are saying what we're going to do in the future is we're actually going to build these data centers as a field in the actual heavens, because up there it's already cold, and all the quantum computing needs to be basically at space temperature of -0 or -273 Kelvin Celsius, all that kind of stuff. So they're talking about building the space centers they're talking about building the data centers in space in the very near future. But they've already got these space stations up there, apparently, whatever height they may be at. So I would imagine what they're talking about is making a whole network of communicators passing on nodes in a field that surrounds the Earth, a mental field of digital pulses of light, passing light information, which is largely what's causing an acceleration in time, or it's happening in tandem with this accelerating in times. So the quickening that we were all talking, not we were all, people like me were aware of a phrase that there's something going on, that's the quickening. And for us back in the 90s and thousands, particularly 90s, it was this idea that time is speeding up. And people who were saying that were likely the people who were taking the DMT, and, well, DMT didn't really come till the noughties in any widespread manner, but the ones of us that were taking magic mushrooms and acid and stuff like that, we were experiencing living in a heightened frequency. We were having more thoughts per second than most people because we'd gone up to a higher frequency on those substances, and we were bringing higher frequency information, higher intensity information, down with us when we came down from those drugs. And it was very hard to translate what had happened in the trip into words that people who aren't trippers might understand. So the correlation between those two halves of the brain was quite difficult on the come down from these things. You're going from extremely high to a deficit of extremely low, and having to raise yourself up after a few days if you didn't just go back into tripping again. But even if one could sustain tripping for months at a time, which was what I used to do, and for decades at a time, which is also what I used to do, it was quite difficult to download so much information from spirit realm into human realm and find a balance, which is why so many of us used to smoke the cannabis as well, to be able to be in a frequency that was somewhat higher than normal people, but not so high that we were tripping all the time that we were going to get sectioned by normal people for being, your behavior is too strange. You don't want kids seeing people going around the way you're going around kind of thing, because a lot of tripping stuff is like naked revelations, and you just want to take your clothes off because clothes are a construct of a human realm from a past and all of that kind of stuff. And just, that's an example, and that's only a sometimes thing. But anyone who's ever been to a rainbow gathering or whatever and seen what happens when a collective of people are in a really high frequency, fucking loads of people get their clothes off, or festivals. I suppose I've seen that mostly at things like Glastonbury Festival, where you're going to get some old hippie guy and women just getting their clothes off in the middle of the night round the fire. And it can be a bit embarrassing to even look at it, like, because these people are out of their minds. Yeah. Kind of stuff. Whereas we live in a society And in the society there are rules, and they are polite rules, and those polite rules are ruled by a policy, and those polite policies are ruled by a police, and that polite police is governed by consent. And the collective in society does consent that the police will track down those who are on the cusp of being too much and disturbing the peace and quiet with psychosis. And I was someone who was fairly consistently doing things that were outside of and somewhat above higher frequency vibrations than what polite society is impressed with. So I would speak faster, and that in itself is trippy. I would speak rhyming all the time, which itself is trippy. I would be explaining concepts which most people have never taught with, which in itself is trippy. And people can get tripped up in that. And I was often accused of being like deliberately messing with people's heads, of being a head wrecker, of being a troublemaker, of enjoying winding people up. Wasn't mean to wind someone up. It's a wind up watch, a wind up clock. It's to make time go quicker. So I was in a higher frequency of time. Time was oscillating faster through my mind than most people in society who are, for example, doing a 9-to-5 job and eating stable food. A lot of what I used to do was like not actually eat for days at a time. It's not like I was technically fasting, but I was being faster, and eating dense food was really difficult for me. So I would smoke spliffs and I would drink coffee. And if I drank alcohol in certain ways, I could bring up traumas that needed processing and bring those low past trauma stuff from previous lives or earlier childhood and bring them into the present moment and act them out, and act them out collectively with all my planets and Libra stuff quite easily. Everything was very collective with me. And if I would be overly dramatic and involve too many people in things that were going on for too long and bringing up collective traumas in individuals, eventually my Saturn in Cancer in the 7th house would engage in its square against my Sun Pluto exact conjunct, and that would be the collective would push me back and suppress me to stop me from acting this stuff out. And the only way of stopping me at times was to put me in a prison cell for a night or for a weekend, because if I'd have drank the spirits, I would be so expressive and so able to express things which my conscious social self would not express, because we have inhibitors, and those inhibitors is in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is running the model of, if I say this stuff, there'll be a reaction of people, you can't say that. And if I want to say stuff that you can't say, which is the definition of psychosis in society, is to go around saying stuff which society is not used to and doesn't agree with, kind of thing. So if one is going around saying things like, I am Jesus, I am the reincarnation of Jesus, I'm the one who wrote the Old Testament lifetime after lifetime, and the Old Testament was written over the space of hundreds of years, and I am the one who held the quill on the parchment and translated these stories onto words, because somebody had to physically write that stuff down, and obviously I'm a really good writer. I am the reincarnation of Shakespeare. I am the reincarnation of Henry VIII. I am Saint Germain. Now these things will obviously confuse people, because they will think if anybody is saying this kind of thing, somehow they're claiming that their personality is the same personality, that their body is the same body, that their soul is the same soul as these famous characters. Whereas actually where I would be coming from in all this is, I am a cell. I am humanity. The I in this case, the I in this case is any I, every I, all I, the pupil of the I am. And that will confuse people. People won't really understand what somebody who's tripping balls is actually trying to communicate, type of thing. That's why it comes across as really quite crazy. So there are those of us who are like, in computer analogy, we're like quantum computers in a classical computer world. We're futurists who have been to the future through our cybernetic journeys on our trips, cybernauts. We are journeying into the future ahead of time and bringing information from the future back to the present. It's really trippy. That's prediction and that's prophecy. So if you believe in the normal idea of what the Bible stories are all talking about, the Bible stories are apparently written by the prophets, and the prophets are apparently speaking about the future, and whoever the Saint Paul and Mark, Matthew, Luke and John, whoever these people are that supposedly wrote all of the Bible all in the space of just like 20 or 30 years, it was all written all at once, and it was never added to afterwards. It was never re-edited afterwards, which is the belief most people have about the Bible. The mystique about the Bible is like it was written by the hand of God through a very few individuals, and it's never been changed since. But it's just a whole lot of denial, and it's a fake truth. Actually, the Bible stuff, the parchments and stories that are collated in the Bible were written over a very long period of time of hundreds and hundreds of years. And there has been editing going on over those hundreds of years. And there has been what to include and what to exclude. Which parchments are we going to put into the official Catholic canon liturgy? And which versions are we going to say, no, we can't put that in. That doesn't agree with what we believe in the 300s AD. That doesn't agree with what we believe in the 1500s and 1600s AD. So this editing process has most certainly been going on, but you've really got to go and study the writing processes and the literary people rather than the religious people to find out literally what really happened in the writings of the Bibles compared to what the medieval people may have claimed was going on, what Constantine might have claimed was going on, what Constantine's name was used after the fact to claim what he was up to and why he did, and whether he had visions and this kind of stuff. And the proofs of this kind of stuff to do with the religions is, for example, in the Jesus story in the Gospels, there are many occasions in which apparently the author is describing what was going on in Jesus' own thought processes in situations where Jesus is entirely on his own. So how can any apostle have been writing down what was going on for Jesus? And logically, the Logos indicates that those authors, whoever wrote the story of Jesus, it wasn't Jesus himself who wrote that story, according to the official story. And my big question, one of my wisest questions over 20 years ago is, why didn't Jesus write his own story? This is a highly educated dude. This is a man who's well able to express himself. This is a storyteller who was able to write. So historically, why would he not have written the stuff down himself? Why would they leave it to some other people to write different versions of it that contradict each other in those four Gospels? Never mind all the other Gospels that are left out of the Bible. But even the four that are included, four being a quandary, there's a quandary in the way the New Testament is written. You can take what you want from it, but you're supposed to do some inference between the four different versions and try and figure it out. It's a figurative story which people have been taking literally as if each word is exactly true. You've got to be a certain kind of stupid to actually think that. And there are millions and billions of a certain type of stupid people on this planet who believe that their version of the text is the only correct version of the text, and they must take every single word and full stop and comma literally, as if it's a computer code that you're processing through your prefrontal core text reader that is built inside in the biological computer of your physical hardware, software of the brain and the neurons and the electricity that's moving between those neurons in the folds of flesh contained within the cranium. So the skull of Golgotha, the Golgotha is the skull. The Golgotha skull is the knoll. The knoll is the height of a hill that if you stand on it, you can see what's going on all around. If you look behind you, you can see the past. figuratively. If you look forward, you can see the future, figuratively. But this stuff is actually going on in a hardware that's very soft, in a biological medium that's very fleshy. And yet the information that's being processed is not being processed in the brain. Just like the things that your mobile phone is doing, most of that processing is not happening in the mobile phone. All that's happening with the mobile phone is it's sending information to the central processor, and the central processor is essentially light. It is light that is processing the information, and perhaps if there's a central processor in our local Earth area that is creating the biological simulation that is Earth, that processing would be happening inside of the sun. And the planets and moons orbiting around the sun are part of the computer that the sun is, that's generating the field of the solar system, in which the Earth is the only part of that physical, biological, material realm, plane of planets, that plane perpendicular across, that is the planets and the sun and the moons. So it shouldn't really make sense that astrology functions. Astrology shouldn't be able to predict the future if we really have free will, and if blah blah blah, what most people believe about the Earth were true. Then you couldn't actually have time, and you couldn't actually have the predictable futures which astrology is able to describe. What's going to be coming up when these planets form this configuration in the language of astrology. If you put all these different words together, you're going to create a sentence that describes what's going on in that moment. And it's following along in the sequence of what's been happening running up to that moment. And it continues on in, after it's done this configuration, it moves into this configuration, and it continues moving in all of these configurations into the future. So astrology is a language which is describing a story, which is a cosmic story, which is reflected in Earth in time. And time, if you were to hold a mirror up to the word time, on this side it says T-I-M-E. On the other side, it's going to be funny, T-I-M-E, and then the mirror, E-M-I-T. It's a palindrome. You spell the words backwards and it spells emit. So time, emit. The sun emits light, and that light travels through space to Earth. And that's the metronome that runs the simulation of this syncretization of time. And the planets spinning around are the cogs in the clockwork that make the clock work. So the solar system is a clock, and we are inside of that clock on the surface of one of the cogs, mechanically, because the solar system is a machine, and that machine is processing time and emitting time, and we are on a version of a timeline. And previous to the version of time that we're in the time of writing. We're in the time where this part of the technology has been functioning for the last 5,125 years. If you want to go along with that Mayan calendar interpretation, that what's written in the Mayan calendar, that's famous, the one that supposedly ended in 2012. Oh, just pulled a muscle into my leg. Ow. Anyway, that's it. But yes, that Zolkin in their language, apparently, according to Jose Arguelles and his book that was published in the 80s, was predicting that 2012, and he was sharing to the Western world that in 2012 we're going to have this thing of the end of time. And that was pretty confusing, but it was easy to stick the end of time with the Mayan calendar end of time, with the Book of Revelations of Christianity end of time, with the Muslim version of the end of time, because they're most definitely on about the same. We've reached a moment in which the Third World War, separation of this, that and the other, and it's all going to be sorted out, and heaven's going to come down to earth, and blah blah blah. And the Jewish people, their end of time, I think, appears to be ending in 2030 or something like that. Who exactly knows? Maybe it's 2050. I don't really know, because a lot of this stuff is kind of secret, but I have looked into it and I have got intuitions on it, and I've got my own, what most people might call Druidic, but I would call megalithic barometer. Meter. My meter is a sort of meter of poetry when it comes to this stuff. I'm gauging time from the whole field of my feminine memory self, kind of thing, and I'm gauging that with the outer time of how things seem to be unfolding, and at the point where the AI, so-called intelligence, as being able to be fed the whole internet of written words and languages, of all languages. That's the Tower of Babel story that was a wounding trauma story becoming a healing story. The idea there was there was a universal language, which the Gaelic Irish stories say Irish was the universal language. But then nasty God threw a comet down. He was like jealous that we were so smart, that the female actually knew more than God in heaven, that what was being processed and computated down here on earth by the feminine was more powerful than what the sun knows. So the sun god kind of attacked the earth and split apart the languages, kind of idea. That's what the Tower of Babel story says, according to the masculines, according to the history that's written down in the masculine religions, where God's all powerful and God has kicked the feminine out of heaven because the feminine is chaos, and he's separated the chaos from the order. And he's divided all these things like it talks about in Genesis. Yeah. So these are a great many concepts that I'm putting across here, and maybe too many, so I'll just leave it there for now. Thanks for listening.